Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Today I'm making an outfit for one of my reborn dolls. If you don't know, a reborn is a really realistic baby doll. Just warning you before I put this video up, it is a doll. So you can see here that the outfit that's currently on this doll is too big of a neckline and is showing the cloth body underneath. I found this is a common problem with dressing pretty much any baby doll really, that if the neckline isn't tight enough, it just kind of looks like it's sagging. However, I do like the style of the outfit and the ruffle and everything, so I'm trying to get something similar. This doll is really small, so as a base, I am using a diaper shirt pattern from the Summer Baby set or something like that by Old Fashioned Baby. And I'm using this because they are one of the few companies that really does a definite newborn size pattern. A lot of baby patterns I've found start at 0 to 3 months, and you wouldn't think there'd be much of a difference but between that and newborn, but in this case it really does make quite a bit of difference. And this is the base, but I am modifying it quite a bit, starting by changing the opening. So the original pattern opens in the front, and I always prefer a back opening on most things. In order to make all these changes, I needed a copy of the original pattern. Usually I copy my patterns by placing my pattern on top of the paper that I'm wanting to transfer it to, and then using a pen to poke holes through both pieces of paper along the lines of the pattern. This does need to be done on a soft surface. I usually do this on the floor because we have carpet, but if you don't have that, or if, like in this case, I wanted to have it up on the table so that you can see it better, you can place a piece of fleece underneath it, and it causes just enough cushion to be able to do this method. So here I'm doing it on the front piece, and this pattern actually has two pieces. It doesn't matter, I don't think, which one you copy it from, as long as the center front is marked on it. Mine was, so what I did was I placed the ruler right parallel with that center front line, and I used my pen to create a line there before continuing to copy the rest of the pattern along the pattern lines. After all the holes were marked, I then removed everything and took my new pattern paper and used a pen to just fill in and connect all of those dots. And that new line that I created along the center front is now my new edge, and it's going to be cut on the fold. So that was the front piece, and believe it or not, that was actually the easy modification. For the back piece, I went ahead and copied the entire piece and drew out all of my lines, but I didn't cut it out yet. Now what I need to do is add room on that straight edge, which is the center back, and originally is meant to be cut on the fold. Well, since I'm turning this into a back opening, I need to add room for the button. And I did that by placing the button on the center back line, so centering my button on it. And then just looking at it and kind of going, okay, this is how much over I need to add. For that, I added a little extra just to give room and drew that line. And you'll see here I'm showing you that you do kind of need to know approximately what size button you're going to have, because that is going to make a difference in how much you need to measure over if you're doing something like this. So that is my second line. That line is what I labeled as my fold line. And then from there, I measured another inch over and drew a final line, and that is my cutting line, and that is just to add a facing to the back opening. And for both the front and back pieces, I added 1/8 of an inch to the seam allowance around the neckline. And this is because for some reason that I don't quite understand, this pattern uses kind of different seam allowances. For most of the pattern, it is a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. For the hem, it's 1/2 inch. And then for the neckline, it's 1/4 inch. And what I found is that when I'm sewing this pattern, I can't keep up with that many different seam allowances. I can kind of remember the 1/2 inch for the hem, but to remember that the neckline has a different length is just a little too much for me. So I added 1/4 of an inch to the neckline so that it is the same seam allowance as the remaining seams. So go ahead and cut out these two pieces, and this gives me a basic back closing shirt. And I want to keep this copy so that I have it, because I do use this style of shirt sometimes and I don't have a good copy. So I went ahead and cut out a second copy of this shirt so that I can continue modifying. So the next changes that I wanted to make are, because I didn't want to do just a plain shirt, I wanted to add some ruffles back to it, though not exactly like the ones in the original outfit. These are a little more inspired by the poppy dress from Peony Patterns. And that one has just a ruffle that starts at the front waist, goes up the bodice, over the shoulder seam, and down to the back waist. So the first thing I had to do was shorten both the front and back pieces. I just used the doll to kind of determine where I wanted it to end. I'm going to consider this more of a yoke. And once I decided where, I went ahead and measured up from the bottom to mark that all the way across the front pattern. I then connected the lines. And this is my stitch line, not my cutting line. So to add seam allowance, I went ahead and measured down from the first line 3/8 of an inch and marked that as the new line. And then I cut right there. I repeated this for the back piece. I knew that I was going to do a lining instead of a facing. Therefore, that back edge, the straight edge, did not need to be as wide as it was. So from the second line, which was the fold line, I measured 3/8 of an inch over towards the edge and marked that and cut it down along that line instead. And now I cut another copy of these pieces, and that's because I need the whole pieces for the lining, and then I need 2 pieces that I can cut apart to do the outer bodice. So after cutting my copies, I take them and I decided where I wanted that ruffle to kind of sit. I did this first on the front one, where I decided where I wanted it, and then I just cut from the shoulder seam straight down to the waist. I repeated this for the back as well, using the front piece to guide where the position of the seam would be, because I did need them to line up. I added a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to all 4 of those cut edges, and then I labeled all of these pieces. So I took the outer front piece and I labeled that front A. The center piece was front B, and I did the same for the back. So the center back was back B, and the outer edge with the arm side is back A. For the ruffle, I started by deciding on the size. The width I determined based on the ruffle on the original outfit, though I did not film it. And then the length was based on measuring along the cut edge from the front to the back of the yoke, that edge where the ruffle is going to be, that side seam that I just fixed, and then doubling that number to get 22 inches. However, I decided to only make my pattern half that size and just cut it on the fold. So I took the pattern and I marked, I believe it was 3 inches by 11 inches on there, and then what I did was just on one of the sides create a curve so that it starts very narrow and gets up to the 3-inch mark, and then I cut it out and labeled that one wider end as being cut on fold. At this point, my plan was just to make the bottom half of the top as a rectangle, so I went ahead and started cutting everything else out. So front yoke B needs 2 pieces cut out on the fold, and then the front A piece as well as both of the back pieces, so both A and B, need 2 pieces cut, as well as 2 of the ruffles and 2 of the sleeves, which I just copied from the original pattern. And then 2 back lining pieces and 1 front lining piece cut on the fold, which I just cut out of a solid white fabric. To assemble, I started by finishing the edges of my ruffles and my sleeves. To do this, I set my machine to this decorative scallop stitch and stitched that along the straight edge of all of those pieces. I then took a small pair of scissors and carefully cut the excess fabric along those scallops, giving me this tiny finished scalloped edge. So for assembling the yoke, that started by attaching the appropriate pieces at the shoulder seams. This is where it gets a little complicated because there are a lot of pieces. For the outer yoke, I have front yoke A, and that attached to back yoke A. And then the same was done with the B pieces. So front B, back B, also attached at the shoulder seams with the right sides together. The lining was much easier because that just had the front and back pieces, and they were also attached at the shoulder seams. Then I ran a gathering stitch along the curved edge of the ruffles. I placed the ruffle right sides together with the outer yoke B pieces and gathered it in place, leaving about a half an inch from the edge of the waist on both the front and back. I then placed the outer yoke A pieces right sides together with the B pieces and sewed along those seams. And here is the yoke when it is actually constructed with the ruffles, and thankfully all in one piece, so now I can stop with all of these A and B pieces. Then I placed the lining on top of the outer yoke with the right sides together and sewed up the back opening, around the neckline, and down the opposite back opening. I clipped the curves and flipped this right side out. At this point, I was still planning on doing sleeves for this, but after looking at the ruffle, I decided that sleeves just weren't going to make sense. So I decided to go ahead and finish the sleeves. I did this by flipping the lining back so that everything was right sides together again, and sewing around the armhole, having made sure to pin the ruffle out of the way so that it would not get caught as I was doing this. Then I clipped those curves again and flipped everything back to right sides out. And lastly, I just sewed the front and back together at the side seams, right sides together. They were a little uneven. My measurement must have been a little off, so I just trimmed down the back so that it matched with the front. Here I decided that I did not want to do a gathered rectangle skirt, and that was just because I was worried that the gathering there would be too much with all the ruffles and everything on such a small garment that was going on a small doll. So instead, I took the bottom pieces of the pattern that I had cut off of the yoke, and I needed to add some more to the top. I needed to add 3/8 of an inch because this piece was 3/8 of an inch shorter than I needed the length to be as a whole, because I took that much off of the pattern to include as seam allowance onto the yoke piece. So I needed to add that back in, plus the 3/8 of an inch for the seam allowance for this piece. So that meant that I ended up adding a total of 3/4 of an inch to the top of both of these pieces. I then cut them out of my fabric. I cut the front piece, one piece on the fold, and 2 of the back piece. I then sewed these 2 pieces right sides together along the side seams. And on the center back openings at the top, I folded them over and stitched them down about 1 to 2 inches or so to create a placket. And I had to fold this over larger than I normally would have because I did not remove the extra fabric along that center back seam. You'll remember there was a placket there originally for the shirt, but that was okay. I just turned it over a little more and it worked fine. I also hemmed the bottom edge. I then placed the top edge right sides together with the bottom edge of the yoke and sewed them. And the last thing I did on the sewing machine was add 3 buttonholes on one side of the back opening, and then placed the entire thing right sides together and sewed from the bottom of the back placket down to the hem. And I attached the buttons by hand. Well, despite using my smallest pattern, this still turned out kind of big for this doll, mainly under the arms, which I knew the armholes were rather big, and that was part of why I had originally wanted to do sleeves. But I think what I might do, I haven't done it yet as of filming this, is just turn the outfit inside out and do kind of like, I guess they would be considered inverted box pleats, sewing kind of like a pleat just under the arm on both sides. That would raise the armhole as well as bring in the sides a little so that it wouldn't be quite so baggy, while still allowing some of the shape and the flaring that it does at the bottom to remain. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another handmade happening.